Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
It's like Nico coming out to everybody and also asking Will out. It's that one.
I skipped that chapter because it made me cringe so hard the first time that I couldn't read it again.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's something about a crowd where like, Nico's forced to like have to be loud and proud.
It's so everybody clapped.
I know. He was the first out gay camper, I guess.
No one's ever done this before. It's actually really groundbreaking. It's kind of giving JoJo Siwa recently.
Listening to Monster Donut, a literary and historical deep dive into the Percy Jackson series and all of its following spin-offs. I'm Emily, a classic scholar-ish.
And I'm Phoebe, a dramaturg and story consultant. And today...
it's the last book I haven't read besides all of the Magnus Chase and Kane Chronicles.
Not only that, it's the last book that takes place within the Greek and Roman world so far. But for now, this is it. The Sun and the Star by Rick Riordan and Mark Oshiro. I want to hear what your expectations were going into this book. Like, what did you already know? What were you looking for from it?
Okay, so I knew Will and Nico go to Tartarus. I did know that going in. And I knew, like, the lead up from Trials of Apollo, where it's, like, Nico hearing Bob's voice. I finally got to listen to Phoebe's episode on The Sun and the Star and your reactions to it. And I was listening to the audiobook, so I forgot that there was, like, that whole black page section until you mentioned it, but I did know that at some point subconsciously going into this book. There's a whole part with like just black pages, which, by the way, the audiobook did not differentiate those at all, nor did they differentiate the like Gorgira sequences. So I was like,
the Gorgira chapters have this little boat, and then also the dreams have these weird like gray mottled
pages. They tell you when they're dreaming, too?
Only when you're supposed to know that they're dreaming. So, like, the whole sequence with the nightmare guy, that doesn't have these pages. So that you're, like, left confused until you know that they're dreaming.
Okay, so this book really holds your hand a lot more than the audiobook does, which is just, like, who's to say what's happening, right? Which I wasn't mad about, but anyway, very different reading experience then. I love the page design, though. They really splashed out on
Yeah,
this.
It's cool. Like, imagine if the Percy Jackson books had, like, different colored pages for when Percy's dreaming versus when he's not.
Next edition.
Okay, before we get into actually discussing this book, I feel like just a disclaimer up front. I did my own episode all about this book when it first came out. So this was my second time reading it. And this is Emily's first. And so I don't want to repeat myself too much in this episode. So I almost feel like you should listen to the other one first. Like, this is a sequel.
Yeah. I'm mostly, I think, going to be responding to what you said.
So go listen to that episode before you listen to this episode if you would like the full story here.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, Nico D'Angelo, why don't you tell me a story?
I know. I was like, oh. Although, I'm not gonna lie, my first note on this first bit is, okay, Stephanie Meyer.
I wouldn't know what you're talking about.
Oh my god, I forgot you've never read Twilight.
We went over this literally in the last episode.
Oh my god. Okay, well, it starts with, like, our dramatic flash forward to what I thought was the climax, so I was like, okay. I did have questions structurally for, like, why, but I think I have an idea as to why the structure of this book is the way that it is, but we'll get into it in a little bit. But it's interesting also because I think it really sets itself apart from other Percy Jackson books. It's like, yeah, no, this is not Percy Jackson the way you're used to it anymore. This is, you know, we have a new author coming in, Mark Oshiro. We have a new voice coming in. We have, you know, this isn't a 5-book series. This is just its own little thing.
But at the same time, it still has... It's not the same kind of framing that Percy uses, but it is that kind of framing of, like, I'm about to tell you a story. The framing to me in this opening, it made me think like they have to tell this story to survive, which I thought was interesting. If you look back at Percy's, we still haven't totally settled on why Percy's telling his story, but it feels like it's sort of a protecting other people. This is how you're going to survive. And it's also, it sets it up so that even though in my head, you know, even though the title of the book is The Sun and the Star and Nico D'Angelo Adventure, he's telling both of their stories. It says, tell me about the two of you at the bottom. This book has a lot to say about the purpose of telling a story, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm looking at my notes, and so many of them are things like, I love that Nico's a Kylo Ren anti.
That's in my notes, too, that I'm like, thank God neither of them chose Kylo Ren. I would have had to cancel them. I do think we should talk about where Nico's at the start of this book.
Yeah, because we did get some hints about him, like, talking to Mr. D about, like, all of his feelings and all of his trauma and stuff. I think in Trials of Apollo. But, like, I feel like over the course of this book, the way they talk about Mr. D and, like, he is Nico's therapist, actually.
Yeah. Which is kind of, I mean, that was kind of how I understood the relationship when I read Tower of Nero, just because it was like, oh, he's going to talk to the god of madness to help him work through.
But for some reason my brain didn't go therapy. It went more like, oh yeah, but like, he's still talking to a god.
Yeah. But, yeah, Nico's mentality at the beginning of this, it's like I am understanding it as, you know, having watched him grow over the last couple books, I feel like he was in a decent place at the end of Blood of Olympus. That like Reyna really helped him work his way through a lot of the things that he's been feeling recently, and then Jason's death seems like it kind of knocked him back.
Yeah.
And he's regressed a lot in that way.
He's summoning ghosts in his sleep.
I feel like there should be a much heavier Reyna presence in this book. Not that she should be here, but that we should be talking more about the journey that Nico was on, and then he got knocked off of it instead of, like, acting like his life has just been going downhill this entire time, and Will is the only light within it.
That's true. That's a really good point. I didn't find myself thinking of Reyna as much, but yeah, like, but it's also because it's been a minute since we've read Blood of Olympus. It was interesting also the way the dreams were sort of used to give us a kind of speed run of, like, everything Nico's been through over the course of this series.
Oh, like the very long dream sequence that comes up soon?
Well, yeah. There are several times in my notes where I, like, entered thinking we were done with the dream, and then I'd be like, oh, just kidding. We're not. This is still one note.
I like that it's a real nightmare. Like, those don't happen really in these books. It's always the characters... Like, characters will say that they have nightmares, but they're always, you know, nightmares about real things that are happening, and they are having basically visions, not, like, nightmares that their minds are coming up with. Although we realize later that this dream is not necessarily something that Nico's brain is coming up with.
But it does feel like one. It's like taking all of the things he's been through and, like, putting it through the twisted funhouse mirror of dream logic.
Yeah, like, demigods will reference having nightmares about things that have happened to them, but they're never on the page. Like, even Percy later on in the book says that he has nightmares about Tartarus, but, like, we would never really see one of those. I think the closest to a nightmare that we've seen from Percy's perspective, or anyone's perspective, is, like, the Hail the Conquering Hero. So I like that this is, like, an actual nightmare.
Yeah.
So it starts out with Nico in darkness. He's hearing his mom's voice, and she's telling him to listen. And then it moves into Nico at the Lotus Casino, lying in bed next to Bianca.
And he is, if you will, a ghost with no tongue.
If you will.
Sort of. I feel like it was more of a Matrix reference with his mouth, like, sewn shut.
Yeah.
But that was my first thought. I was like, oh, is he a ghost with no tongue?
My first thought was Loki.
Oh, well, this is the difference between you and I.
But it's during this part of the dream that he says that he wished that he inherited Hades' dream magic, which Nico does have some of Hades' dream magic. He was able to come to Percy in his dreams at the beginning of The Last Olympian, and he went to Thalia in her dreams in The Blood of Olympus. So he does have some control over dreams, but it doesn't seem like he has control over his own dreams, only other people's.
I love that for him. Do you think Bianca does too? I mean, she was sending Percy like iris messages, but like in his sleep, right?
She was. I never thought of that as like dream magic. I thought of that as like your house is haunted.
Yeah, but like it is made canon in this book that ghosts dream. So I'm just saying. Mm-hmm. Ghosts can still use dream magic. Also, maybe. I do kind of love her, like, becoming a hunter of Artemis and having dream magic. Like, she is the moon. Like, because we never, like, get a cool power from Bianca. So it would be kind of cool, aside from, like, her stabbing the skeleton and it dying. But that doesn't feel like a special power. Like, I would love... I'm in my headcanon now is that Bianca had really good dream magic.
Mm-hmm. And then the next part of this dream is the bridge scene. When I got to this part, the first time I read this, I was like, the bridge scene?
I know. When he was like, I was on a bridge in New York City. I was like, wait, is this?
Not the bridge. It wouldn't be the bridge.
And then I was like, was Nico even there? And then he was like, no. I wasn't there.
That's why I was trying to piece together why, because I think the dreams are coming from Nyx, right?
Yeah. Well, yes. They are.
I was just trying to figure out why she would show him. Like, I can understand why show Bianca saying this stuff, why show Percy when he's in the jar, and, like, all of that, but why show this moment, when Nico wasn't even there for this moment?
I have two thoughts. I thought Percy factored into this book in an interesting way, where I was like, he keeps... There's little things that keep popping up here, and I don't know exactly why, but I want to figure it out. And there's something about Nico and his relationship with Percy that I do think gets unpacked in this book. Like, settled behind the scenes. That was sort of my initial reaction. I was like, why are we setting us up where it's almost like Percy's the bad guy? Like, we're on Kronos' side and we're turning around and there's Percy.
Blocking the way.
He's blocking the way and he's about to get Michael Eude.
The way that I'm explaining this part of the dream to myself is that because Nico wasn't there, he has only heard Will's version of this story, and in Will's perspective, this moment was terrifying. Right. To watch Percy, like, fight his way across the bridge, thanks to the Curse of Achilles, which we talked about. None of the Apollo campers knew what was going on. Percy showed up fighting like that. Then there's Kronos approaching, and in this dream, he's, like, huge and golden. You know, he's not Luke. He's Kronos. No. And then it's, you know, Percy breaking the bridge, which indirectly killed Will's brother and left Will the new head of the Apollo cabin following the death of two brothers. Yeah. And then Percy came back and was like, get on that motorcycle, we're going to save Annabeth. And that was the first time we met Will.
I forgot that was like, that's when Will became, okay, this got way juicier. Hold on.
And so, like, I'm imagining that the reason this part feels like this is because Will watching this moment, these characters are like it's Percy, Michael Yu, and Annabeth standing in Nico's way, plus Will. And so those are, like, the key players from Will's perspective
and
of
they're
watching.
on the Williamsburg Bridge, baby. It all comes together. The other thing is, like, coming back to this scene now that we've sort of gotten a lot more from what the theme of this book is, according to the book. I'm going to say what the theme of this book is according to the book, and then...
Okay.
We'll see if I have a different answer after we finish this conversation, because I kind of have to believe the book, but it was about, like, what Nyx was saying about Nico kind of having, like, he's sort of caught between these two sides, and it's interesting because this moment is him seeing Kronos on one side and running away, and then seeing Percy on the other side and also kind of running away. It's like him being caught between these two things. I literally wrote in my notes, trapped between the two lines. It's like monsters and demigods on one side, demigods on the other. Like, he feels like he is not one of the good guys.
In those books, it felt like, you know, he couldn't stand on either side. That's true.
Yes, Nico was sort of perfectly in between. No wonder why Nemesis took a liking to him.
Okay, what is the next part of this dream? What is this?
He's in the jar. He falls in the... I think Percy breaks the bridge. He falls and he's in the jar. Am I...
No. That would be cooler. That would be much cooler. Kronos, like, swings his scythe at Nico and then he falls.
And then in the dream, Percy... opens the jar and is like looking down at him, and like Percy's a giant now. Like Percy's kind of giant. Nico like shrinks, and
Percy's described as the size of a titan.
So we got another like, what's going on here with Nico and Percy? What's going on?
The way that Nico looks at Percy in this book is it's one of my favorite parts about this book. Because you figure, you read the end of Blood of Olympus and they're like, and Nico solved it. He feels totally neutral about the guy now. They're friends. And then you're in Nico's perspective and you're like, oh, this is messy. It's
a mess. I can't wait to talk about this more.
Yeah, I feel like we're going to talk a little bit about this when we get to the actual Percy scene, I think is where I took my notes on this. But yeah, I remember when I first read this dream, that was what I latched onto most, was the way that Nico was describing Percy in this dream.
Something we haven't talked about that's sort of peppered in through these scenes is a lot of inner monologue. First with him just talking about Percy and his sort of, I guess, trauma related to Percy, where, like, I wrote down the line, like, he became used to the fact that he wanted things he couldn't have. Mm-hmm. And he, like, linked all of these things he wanted with this idea of, like, stability. So he, like, wanted all these things that to him represented stability, even though Percy Jackson should not represent stability to you. And, like, that was, like, a desire of his that he's sort of never gotten fulfilled. And then, like, right after that, interestingly, is also where we get, the Jason-less Cupid scene, which is, again, like, desire that's kind of unfulfilled, but then we kind of build on it a little bit, too, where he sort of talks about how that scene with Jason, even though it ended well for him, was still quite traumatic. That like, being forced to kind of come out to Jason not on his own terms. And there is something about Nico and having to do things in front of an audience that he really doesn't like, that also is kind of threaded through this book. Mm-hmm. And then he sees Cupid as Will. But in this version, Cupid isn't really that scary. The horror is really the absence of Jason instead of Cupid.
Right, and we get this moment of peace with Will, which is ruined by his mouth opening too wide, which I hate. And then Nico waking up.
We get the prophecy. The one who calls your name, who suffers and despairs for refusing to remain, there leaves something of equal value behind, or your body and soul no one will ever find. And then I just wrote down, obviously setting up that Nico thinks he has to give up Will, which I don't think was that good of a prediction. I think even Nico was like, oh no.
Yeah, I felt like because the book was telling me that, like, this is what we assume it's going to be, I was like, that's not what it's going to be. And I also, with his storyline in Battle of the Labyrinth, I was like, we've already been through this idea. Nico wouldn't sacrifice someone else's life for his goals. That's not something he's comfortable with. Because he wouldn't do it with Percy to get Bianca back. And if that's not worth it, why would Bob be? Right. They set up this quest, which Chiron allows them to go with just 2 people. We're getting too lax with these rules. I need the quests to be 3 people again.
Yeah.
Bring back 3-person quests and there being consequences for breaking that rule.
I love that the, like, reasoning, though, is like, Percy and Annabeth did it, therefore this is fine.
I was like, they didn't do it on purpose. And it wasn't a quest when they did it. It's not like they got a prophecy and everything,
I mean, there were 7 on the Argo, too.
Which is why I thought that only 3 were going to make it out of there. Because I was like, I saw this in the Titan's Curse. 2 of those girls died because there were 5 people on that quest. Whatever. It's fine. It was only true once. I'll deal with it.
Then they're heading to New York. We are slowly but surely establishing Percy as, like, your first stop post Camp Half-Blood on your quest.
Yeah.
It's like, all right, you get your prophecy, you go on your quest, you go visit
Percy Jackson. And then you're allowed to go. Also, I love that Nico thinks to himself, oh no, Will needs someone to kind of calm him down. I'll go to Percy Jackson, who, rumor had it on the Argo too, was torturing people for fun down there. This will calm Will down. I feel like the logical place to go is Annabeth, without Percy there.
I know you have a lot of thoughts about this scene. Although, I'm not gonna lie, I forgot to say, I did know Phoebe, because you said it, like 2 episodes ago. You said there was one scene that made you really mad. So I knew there was a scene in this book that made you really mad. And for some reason, I didn't think it was this one. And I'm reading this book, like, waiting for the scene that made Phoebe really mad. And I was like, I don't know which one it was. And then as soon as I listened to your episode, I was like, oh, of course. And then Percy says he still has nightmares about Aklis.
Yeah, specifically. I was like, that's interesting. And the fact that the nightmares that are some of the worst ones that he has about Tartarus are about what he did down there instead of the things that happened to him down there. He might be a little bit afraid of himself.
Mm-hmm. Annabeth also forgot about Bob.
This made me so mad this time. And there's that line where it's like, it's treated as if they willingly left Bob and forgot him down there. And there's that line where Nico thinks to himself, like, maybe because Bob thought I would help, but he wasn't sure about you two. And he says that about, like, why Bob would be calling out to Nico instead of Percy. And I was like, I mean, Percy and Bob were on sort of odd terms when Percy left, because Bob felt rightfully manipulated. But at least Annabeth and Bob had a closer relationship. Like, Bob cared for her.
Also, like, I went back and I re-listened to our House of Hades episode, because I was trying to remember where we left off with Bob and Damison. And Annabeth is the one at the end of the Tartarus thing where she's like, we will tell their story. They will never be forgotten. That's what Annabeth was saying. She gives this beautiful speech about it. So, okay, let's turn it around. We gotta make it analysis, baby. Okay.
I know, I do have in my notes, like, let's talk about the idea that Annabeth and Percy would go through all of that and then forget. Was it so traumatic that they've completely, like, without meaning to, they've blocked out a lot of their Tartarus experience?
It could be. That's valid.
I don't know if we've seen evidence of that elsewhere. I mean, they remember it clearly enough to give tips and tricks.
Yeah, but they don't mention, like, the Phlegathon.
Yeah, I was like, there are some things here that you could be giving very specific notes on. Like, when I was thinking about, you know how I did in my last episode where I complained for, like, half an hour about this scene? I think I brought up Percy in the original series would have followed Nico down there, or at least said something about wanting to go with him in this scene. While I was thinking about that this time around, I was thinking about what details I would expect Percy to give if he's not going to say, I want to come with you. And one of them is like, when you get down there near this landmark, there is a temple where you can send messages. And I want you to send me a message to let me know that you're okay.
Yeah.
So it's like stuff like that where it's like these little things that might have helped them.
Yeah. And then like they're like asking about the experience. They're like, wow, it was so scary.
It was so bad, Will. You're going to die down there. Okay, as long as you're together, though.
Don't you know that the highest shipped couples, those are the ones that make it through?
The people love you. You'll make it out.
You know what's funny, though, is they do make it through Tartarus because of their ship.
But I could see, like, if we want to chalk this up to Percy and Annabeth have actually blocked out a lot of what happened in Tartarus, and so the things that stick with them are, like, rather than the more positive things about that experience, are, like, the really scary parts of that experience, because those are the things that come back in their nightmares, so things that might have helped Nico and Will, and also helped them remember Bob, have left them. I don't believe it, but...
I mean, that seems to be what has happened.
Unbelievable. But something else I'd like to point out that is related to this is that, I mean, I already mentioned the importance of telling your story is like a theme of this book. And Percy isn't telling his to his mom. His mom says he knows nothing. He doesn't tell her the details. And I just think that's interesting in a book that's full of people being like, it's very important to tell your story. And later on, we even have Nico going on like a 60-page storytelling experience, it sounds like, to explain his experience in Tartarus. And at the beginning of this book, we find out that Percy hasn't said any of it to his mom. And probably not to Annabeth, according to me.
I don't think so. I guess this means they have to unpack it at some point in Wrath of the Triple Goddess or the next book.
I can't imagine that they can talk about Tartarus comfortably in front of each other and in front of Nico without having had this conversation with each other already. So...
And we have no reaction to the Jason situation.
We have, at the very end of the scene, either Percy or Annabeth is like, we can't lose another friend. That's the only reference.
Right.
They're fine, though. They're doing so normal.
Okay, so having consulted the new... What position is this? The sage? Like, what... Like, normally this would be the oracle, but he's not the oracle. So, like, what is Percy's position in this quest? Has he fully come into being the herald or whatever the Mithras thing was?
Oh, yeah, what was that? I don't remember what his was. Wasn't his role, like, the descent into the underworld in the Mithras thing? Like, the descent into darkness?
It was.
So that's when you visit Percy, is right before your descent into darkness.
And then they go to Central Park, to the doors of Orpheus. Our yellow flowers appear. So we're staying consistent, I guess, to the... Remember in Sword of Hades? There's a yellow flower.
I forgot about that. Yes.
We don't need to get into the nitty-gritty. Basically, Will and Nico start descending into the underworld.
Yeah. I had a theory when I was reading this scene was, because as soon as they go in, I think Nico describes he feels a presence behind him, and then he looks back and there's nothing there. And I was like, this place is haunted by Eurydice. I've solved it.
That would have been good.
I'm so good at being wrong about things.
This is interesting also, because I want to flag this, because I feel like the way mythology is used in this book is different than a Percy Jackson book. Because the mythic parallels feel a lot more subtle to me in this version. Not that Percy Jackson is, like, it's not subtle in a bad way. It's just, like, usually the myths are a lot more explicitly paralleled, or if, like, whatever is there, there's, like, a little more than what we get here. But there was definitely strong Orpheus and Eurydice vibes for this part. Because we get, like, Will hearing something Nico can't. We've got, like, all of this stuff where they feel like Nico feels like the stairs are longer than normal. Like, there's all these, like, little things. And he looks back twice. And each time he looks back is sort of when the loop resets. Like, they are about to get to home for Nico, which is the underworld. He looks back. Mm-hmm. They are reset again. Like, Will can't see the end. Again, we bring Percy into it in a really weird and interesting way, where Nico remembers Percy leading them down the doors of Orpheus the first time they went.
Yeah, and Nico's leading the way now.
The way he says it, he's like, Percy led me down, like, right before I betrayed him. So I was like, is Will gonna, what's happening? What is this setting up? I think ultimately just, like, all of these complicated Percy feelings, where there are so many moments in this book where it was, like, an almost Percy parallel, but then not quite. And I kind of feel the same way about, like, the mythology, where it's, like, almost Orpheus and Eurydice. Like, the vibes are very strong, but not quite. There's crucial bits missing, where this isn't, like, a reenactment. And it's the same thing with the dreams, too, where it's, like, this is almost what it was, but it's not. There's something different. It's an interesting recurring thing that is over the course of this book that I think also kind of gives it this dreamlike quality, where you're just, like, never... It's kind of slippery, which I think for me, like, the framing device with Gorgira, I think also enhances. Because, again, with the audiobook, they didn't differentiate these chapters at all. So the way I experienced this book was just like, what's going on here? For, like, a good number of chapters. I was like, where are we in time? I don't fully, like, is this real? Is this not real? Especially this part.
Yeah, I mean, this part doesn't have anything to let you know that they're dreaming at all.
Yeah, so. Which I liked a lot. I was like, oh, this is good. Like, it's sneaky. It tricks you for, like, a good while.
Yeah. On the Percy subject, Nico has a line here where he says, it's funny how the older Nico got, the more he saw things about Percy differently. Which was a line that made me think about the way that Percy now thinks of Luke. But there's also this like running thing of Nico, like sometimes he's talking about how, you know, he wanted Percy in a certain way not too long ago. And there are moments where he's talking about how he feels like really disillusioned by him. And I was thinking about meeting myths and that Percy was a part of the myths and the way that Nico approached this world at the beginning. Like to Nico, he was one of several heroes within the mythology. Yeah, so I was thinking a lot about Percy as something that to Nico was always a part of the mythological world. And like is almost comparable to Percy meeting Hercules or Achilles or something.
I mean, that makes sense because the way, I mean, again, he's introduced in this book by like, it's the bridge scene when he's arguably at his most, this is when rules cease to apply to him. And also like, again, seeing him as like this Titan-sized, like giant figure, like, rescuing him. Like,
it's all very mythic. The way we talk about Percy in this book is very mythic.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
But anyway, the dreams are happening. How did you feel about this perspective shift into Will's point of view?
It was interesting. We'd spent a sufficient amount of time in Nico's head that I think, structurally speaking, it felt like that was all we were going to get. So it was kind of, like, jarring to actually get Will's perspective.
Yeah, it's disorienting.
Yeah, it's disorienting, and I think, again, the way it's used with the dreams, it's...
Mm-hmm.
I really, structurally speaking, I think this part is brilliant. Like, the way it uses things to really mess with your head. Like, it really puts you in this headspace that I think it's pretty rare. It's rare to read a book. Like, it's taking this idea of, like, an unreliable narrator and really having a lot of fun, where it's like, well, what if the narrator isn't... It's not so much the narrator that's unreliable as the book. The book is lying. Everything's lying. But I think what it does is it really, like, stamps on you. You're not gonna know when things are real and when they're not real. Like, you're not gonna know the difference almost between, like, your fears and reality. I enjoyed the subtlety with which their fears were being brought out in the dreams. Like, I felt like Nico's fear of Will, like, not accepting the underworld as a place he loves, like, not loving the underworld, like, not... It's like there was, like, this feeling that was so clear to me of him just feeling really afraid to get rejected, even though there's no reason he would think that, just off these, like, tiny little moments or comments. And then we get Will dreaming and being afraid of holding Nico back, slowing him down. But I think there's also that fear with the sticks of him, like, having to jump in and, like, be a hero and get on the battlefield, essentially.
That's a good diagnosis of that fear.
And I think in the same way Nico's sort of living in a space where he's afraid of something becoming, this idea he has becoming real, but what he's afraid of is this idea he has that Will won't love every piece of him becoming real, which is, like, kind of what the underworld here sort of represents. And that's why it's interesting, it's like a reversal too. Like, he's not leading Will out of the underworld, he's leading him home, which is into the underworld, which is not supposed to be the hard part. In all of Greek mythology, it's quite, well, not easy, but relatively easy to get in.
I think you also see a lot of Will's fears in the dream that he has right after this while they're fighting the guy.
Mm-hmm.
And he dreams of Apollo and Meg. But you can see that he potentially fears his dad actually not keeping his promises and not coming to help when he should.
Yeah. And he just fears Meg.
And he just fears Meg, who's just there to be Meg. Right, it's Apollo, Will, and Rachel all saying that Will needs to heal him. Meg saying, you're supposed to be good at this, which is... Apollo would never say that, and then Meg says that, and you're like, Meg would say that. Oh, and Apollo at the end says, finally, you're good for something. You make an excellent spare battery.
Oh, yeah. And as we learn later in this book, spare batteries, easily lost and forgotten. Easily left behind. I love the battery arc that just comes full circle in this book. Anyway, then we finally get Nico breaking out of the dreams. This, again, extended dream sequence. And he sees a creature with a bunch of eyes, a beak, tentacles. And then he immediately Percy's this creature. And, like, when I'm saying Percying, I'm like, this took me all the way back, where he's just like, wow, you're so amazing at what you do. Wow, amazing work. Wow. Like, all the while being like, how do I kill this thing? How? It's incredible work, honestly. And if you're like, Emily, why aren't you giving me the lore on any of these things that show up? It's because there isn't any. I'll come back to that. But there isn't any lore. Anyway, then Epialus succeeds in sending Nico back into Dreamland once again. And we're getting the scene of Percy telling Nico that Bianca's dead.
Didn't that moment also say that Beckendorf and Selena were there when that happened? I was like, I do not remember that. Several dead people in this room, huh?
Yeah. Also, again, it's like an audience? Because I don't think there wasn't. I think it was just the two of them, right?
Yeah, I didn't remember so many people being in the room.
Yeah. So again, we got this recurring thing where it's like all of his worst memories being like made worse by there being an audience to his pain. Which on a meta level is interesting on account of the fact that this entire book is inviting an audience to his pain.
Telling his story to share that pain with other people.
Yeah. which makes sense given the ending, but we see Dr. Thorne cameo, and then Will is actually able to fight off Epiales with a light bolt from his chest.
With a laser.
Love that for him.
Considering some of the stuff that happens later in this book, I found this moment for Will interesting, where he has that hesitation, where he's like, I feel like I shouldn't be doing this to this demon, actually, and then does it anyway.
Yeah.
I felt like rereading this book, knowing about the argument that Will and Nico have about Nico killing Octavian, and then also knowing that, like, the second that they get to Tartarus, Will goes a little bit Percy mode. This line I'm talking about is, this guy says, blast me with your light, get it over with. And it says, Will hesitated. It somehow seemed wrong to blast someone on request, but Epiales was a demon. They'd regenerate down in Tartarus anyway, starting the cycle all over again. They were a monster, Will was a demigod. That's how it worked, right? He senses Will's reluctance, he lashes out at Will, and Will kills him. And I was like, I feel like this is the start of this kind of arc that I was trying to track the first time that I read this book.
Yeah.
And also, just to flag that that's how Will approaches all of this, because he's new to, like, the kind of... I imagine that Will has never been on a quest.
No.
And is sort of new to this idea of being a hero. And so that line of, they were a monster, Will was a demigod, that's how this works. Just knowing that that's how he's coming into this book, while we know that Nico is definitely not coming into it from that perspective.
Yeah. My next note is Echidna and a Chimera, because I don't think I wrote one note about these troglodytes.
I have the exact same. I go from this to Tartarus flashback.
You know what? This isn't even true. I had a whole thing. Okay, because I was reading this last night, and I fell asleep at one point, and I, like, caught myself falling asleep and, like, stopped to pay attention. I was like, all right, time for bed. And I paused it, and I went to bed. And I was like, maybe this is why I completely missed that Nico was telling his story about the first time he went to Tartarus when we transitioned into it. And it really threw me off, because I was like, is this another dream sequence? What's going on? And I was like, oh, that's so meta if I fell asleep during the transition, and that's why I'm confused. But I don't know, it's not.
No, he very explicitly says, let me tell you my story, and then tells his story for 60 pages.
Like, let me tell you my story. And then the audiobook doesn't say chapter 50. It just went into it. I missed that transition. This was the point where I was like, what is this book doing to me? But I do think that one is on me, to be fair. But yeah, anyway, Nico tells the story.
We learn that back in Son of Neptune times, when we know that Nico went down into Tartarus, he went into the underworld and found presumably the same pit that we found in The Lightning Thief. When he gets there, Echidna appears. Which the note I made here was, there are a lot of mothers in this book. Because we've got Echidna appearing here at the start of our journey. We've got this reference to Mother, who will turn out to be Nyx. We have Nico's repeated thoughts about his mom. We have Nico meeting with Sally instead of Percy at the beginning of the book. And then Nico and Will both grew up with their mortal mothers.
I mean, Nemesis.
Nemesis was the other one, because I was like, we've only really known... I mean, technically we've met Nemesis beyond her role as a mother, but in my head, I'm always like, Nemesis, mother of... Ethan Nakamura. But then at the end of the book, we have Nico as father. So, but mothers and mothering is really important to this novel, it feels.
Persephone. No, she's not a mother. She's a stepmother.
In a way, she's a mother, but just to her fans. So, Nico falls into Tartarus. I feel like we need to note that falling into Tartarus does not kill you from this pit. We have evidence. Nico fell into that pit and did not die. His bones should have broken. He says that. He didn't die, even though he hit the ground hard. I feel like this is important for certain conversations that we've had about this pit in the past.
So Nico lands in Tartarus, and immediately there's a figure beckoning to him to the shrine that Percy and Annabeth went to. And it's Nemesis.
I wrote down one of her lines. Did I write down more of her lines, or just this one?
My only true home is in the hearth and the spirit when true balance is achieved.
No, but that's a good one. Talk about that one.
Well, it basically just she's talking about my only true home is in the hearth and the spirit. So not just inside, like in your own like feelings, but also in your home. It's just like this about this idea of balance, and I guess balancing the scales. And then she sort of shows Nico the form of Hades and talks about how justice. Did you write this quote down? I didn't write
this is the quote that I wrote down.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
She says, "Your father tries, but even here in the place of final judgment, true fairness is so rarely achieved. The good suffer, the bad are rewarded. The gods' great system is a creaky machine, a lopsided wheel. At times we must act individually. You must act to achieve a proper justice, just as you are doing now."
Can we talk about Nico and justice? Because you said this in your wrap-up, and I was like, the last episode, and I was like, oh yeah.
Yeah, I feel like a defining part of Nico's journey in the first series was about his relationship to justice. I don't know if I would say that about the second series. I'd have to think about it. But I know in the first series, a lot of it was about, like, especially in Battle of the Labyrinth, finding justice and, like, what was fair. Especially because we talked about the parallels between Nico and Ethan. And there, whenever he's sort of killed someone, except for maybe Octavian, it's sort of like because it is their time, because it's fair for them to die now.
Even like, what was his name? Bryce?
Yeah, it was like, it's past your time, you're not supposed to be alive right now, it is right for you to be dead. But yeah, in my head, Nico has always been tied to justice, and I feel like has a firm grasp on like what is just and what is fair to him. So I was glad that Nemesis appeared to him and talked to him like this, and talked about his father's role in judgment and how it is still flawed. But I think I was really focusing on this because I recorded with Seaweed Brain this morning about the Kane Chronicles.
Oh, you did now?
And there's a line where they say that they fight gods constantly to keep them under control. And I was like, where is that energy? When are we going to start doing that over here?
Well, Luke Castellan would like a word.
Right, and it's like, over there, it's totally fine and normal to do that. Over here, you're the villain of an entire book series for doing that. I find that, I feel like Percy and Carter need to hang out, and Percy to realize some things during that conversation.
Yeah, there's a reason that No, they did hang out, but there was other stuff going on.
They did hang out, but they hated each other, so I don't know.
That's how they get you. I think you said something, maybe it was in your last episode, or maybe it was earlier today, I can't remember, where you were talking about how Nico telling his story was interesting also because you felt like it was quite mythic the way he told it. Because you were talking about it with relation to storytelling, I think. And you were mentioning that Nico, like, in the book tells his own story explicitly, and is also sort of kind of implicitly telling this also. But I do think that's kind of cool because it's like this little story does kind of contain the structure of like a very old school myth to me, where it's like, oh, we're gonna go into the cave, oh, there's a god that's gonna point you in the right direction, and they're gonna give you the 3 seeds. And like when I saw the 3 pomegranate seeds at first I was like, 3 pearls, like again it felt very like and then we also see him kind of repeating all of the beats of Percy and Annabeth went through. He sees a bunch of eyes, and at first, because I completely missed that this was supposed to be him telling his story somehow, I was like, it's another dream. But now I'm like, wait a minute, are those the Kako demons? Is this when they were birthed?
Yeah, I was rereading this book, I was trying to keep track of like the little hints of them showing up, because I remembered them showing up multiple times in this book. But I feel like I missed so many of them.
I'm just thinking, like, what we're given is, like, as soon as he entered Tartarus, basically, that was when they spawned. So I'm like, oh, that makes sense if it was the first time. Because also at that point, he was the only mortal to have entered Tartarus ever, and at least made it out again. So that makes more sense to me as to, like, because I'm not gonna lie, that was a question I had, at the ending, where I'm like, why is Nico the one with the demon babies? Why is Nico singled out for having demons? I feel like they're all pretty traumatized. But if, like, this is actually why, that actually makes much more sense to me. It's like, oh, finally, a demigod has entered Tartarus, and he's, like, really traumatized, actually. So let's take that trauma and turn it into monsters. Actually, you could argue Percy and Annabeth also got their trauma turned into monsters, but the monster was Percy.
You could.
I'm just saying. But I was like, that's such an interesting choice to like have to recount the parts where he figures out all this stuff, especially because it doesn't really come back. Like, they don't use the phlegathon when they go back. And there's also this like recurring line that happened. It happened twice, where the instructions Nico gets is, oh, follow this thing to the left and keep going. And I was like, that feels very Peter Pan to me. Like, second star to the left and straight on till morning.
It's the second star to the right, actually.
Right, but in Latin, left is sinistra, so we're gonna go to the sinister direction. You know what? It's not Peter Pan so much as it feels very story-y, you know? Yeah. Like, the directions are, just go left. That's a map. That makes sense. That's how directions
Especially in
work.
A place that, like, you could very easily walk in circles and not realize it.
Yeah, because that's the thing, too. Like, I feel like Tartarus is a very dreamscape environment. It's very strange. So again, I feel like it kind of continues this thing of like, you don't know where you are or what's going, like it's fully disorienting. And that sort of continued on by him seeing and entering the House of Nyx, because then he enters the House of Nyx, and again I'm getting a Percy flashback, because it's like Hypnos talking to Nyx, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, we're being watched. And I was like, this so much reminds me of that Chronos dream. I don't know. Like, again, there's like this little thing where I'm like, there's all these little moments, and they don't quite add up into a picture for me, but they feel like references. Where I feel like, again, we're kind of putting Nico in the space of Percy, but like when he's like younger and doesn't know as much, and he's just like, what's going on? A primordial power talking to its servant, and I'm happening upon it. And again, this made much more sense because at this point I still thought this was a dream sequence.
But I still see it. I still get it.
But I think now's also the time, because that, again, me thinking this was a dream sequence did lead me to kind of my big breakthrough, which is still applicable. Because I think structurally also the reason why this is very cool to me, and also why I kind of like starting with the Gorgira situation, is because I feel like what it does is it makes every event in this book feel unmoored in a way where not just you don't really know the difference between reality and not, but in a way that it almost doesn't matter, because like it made me feel the memories were not fixed events in the past, but rather this book treated them like they were things that must be experienced again to bring back forward. Like, there are things that you're constantly experiencing kind of in some level of yourself. Like, to remember is not just to remember, but it is to re-experience, is kind of what I'm trying to say. And also, like, in re-experiencing them, though, things shift and change, depending on how you've changed. It got me thinking a lot about that, because I think also because so much of this book is about dealing with, effectively, PTSD, like, that makes complete sense, where, like, one of the symptoms of PTSD is, like, reliving your memories, essentially, like, getting pushed, like, forced back into, you know, a situation where you might not even have full awareness of what's going on around you, like, you know, in the here and now where you are. So I really thought that was a cool way to format and structure this book, where I think it really forces you to not think about memory in the way that I think you're used to. And I think it also really serves what this book is saying about trauma also, where it's like, this is a bunch of things that are part of you, not these are things that happen to you.
I really want to connect this to the chapter that I sent you a picture of from Professor Gregory Nodge's The Greek Hero in 24 Hours, because there's a portion at the beginning of that book where he's talking about memory and like the idea of like recalling something perfectly. And I know I have the book open in one of my tabs. Okay. It's Hour 2, Achilles as epic hero, and the idea of total recall in song. And it was talking about the idea of saying, like, I have total recall, as in you're re-experiencing it as you tell the story. And it was something that I have this open on my computer because I was going to reference it in our Riordan verse wrap-up while talking about Percy telling his story, to, like, help us with that conversation, but it feels very relevant now. He says, I'm not going to know how to pronounce this word. Memnemai.
I.
And he explains, when this verb takes an object in the genitive case, it means I remember in a general sense, I have memories of, but when this verb takes an object in the accusative case, as here, it means I remember in a special sense, I remember totally. And then uses Story of the hero Phoenix, which is a micro-narrative inside of the Iliad. I can't talk about this completely because I need to finish the chapter so that I can talk about it in a Riordan verse wrap-up, but it's this idea that is an inherent part of the ancient Greek hero. Of recounting stories with total recall. To remember is to relive an experience. Is the exact quote from this passage. Anyway, I will say more on this subject in our full Riordan verse wrap-up, because at that point I will have hopefully finished this chapter of this book, but it just reminded me of this chapter that I'm like halfway through right now. Okay, we're post-Tartarus flashback. The pages are white again.
Then they get to the fields of Hades with Menoetes.
I love him. I do need to point out a theory that I had before this book came out, because we knew this guy's name, but we didn't know anything about him. Because there is also a son of Iapetus who has that same name.
Oh.
Who's, according to Wikipedia, perhaps the titan god of violent anger and rash action. And so, like, I did a whole deep dive trying to learn more about this guy, because I was like, of course this is the one that we're going to meet in this book, because it's the son of Bob. And then he showed up on the page and was like, I'm a bull man.
I'm a bull man, and I'm dating Geryon, actually.
It's so funny. Like, I feel like I've had this feeling twice, and once was reading this book, and then once was just recently finding out that Benny and Garth from Supernatural were dating in real life.
I love that choice, though, where, again, I'm gonna come back to this a little bit, but, like, his only real thing in mythology is, like, he's linked to Geryon, because they're sort of similar. And a decision was made that they're dating, and I like that a lot.
It's a great decision.
Yeah. Because I think when he first rocked up, I remember being like, Geryon, ? But that can't be right. He's only got one body. Anywho, they get sent on a side quest to go steal something from Persephone's garden. I liked this scene a lot. I liked that Nico can't steal them because it won't hurt him. And Will has that whole realization. And then Will and Persephone get a scene together. That's really good. This is, I think, the best scene in the book.
I might agree with that.
This whole bit where Will's saying, like, it feels like Nico doesn't want my light. I'm like, I love that. I think I also like this scene because I like that we're kind of playing with the idea where, we're going into this book like, right, we've got the shadow man, the dark, moody, broody boy that's got a lot of trauma, and we've got the ray of light. We've got the guy that, like, he's been in battles and stuff, but he's the healer. Like, he's never really killed anybody. Like, we even get, like, later when they're going into the Acheron, all of his, like, trauma is, I let people do things. That's why I'm evil. Which is fair, but, like, compared to the other stuff, compared to a lot of other people and other characters we've seen go through this stuff, it's like, the order of magnitude is much lower in terms of bad things done. But it's, like, kind of a trope in that way, where it's like, oh, the darkness and the light walk into a bar, the light's gonna act like a light, the dark's gonna act like a dark, and I like that we're starting to break down a little bit. Because I feel like it's also a thing you see a lot in stories, and I would even argue, like, there's a case to be made that a lot of, like, gay stories, especially gay stories written for younger audiences, they tend to be quite a lot more black and white in terms of, like, what's good and bad within the relationship. They're just a lot less messy, because they're not really given the space to be messy. So I do kind of like this idea that we're playing with that a little bit, where we're like, no, actually, these things that seem quite defined in this dynamic are not going to always be this way. That this character you're supposed to have on a pedestal shouldn't be there because they're a real person. So they have darkness inside of them. They're not always perfect. They're not always this bright ray of light. Likewise, the shadowy one isn't always a shadow, isn't always doom and gloom.
Yeah, there's this one line that Persephone has. A god or demigod so surrounded by death, they seem to appreciate life more than anyone else. They understand it, even if they don't always drift toward it. And she also earlier before that says, I had to reconsider everything I believed about light and dark, about life and death. And then she gestures at Nico and says he has all of those things within him, just like his father. But what I most appreciated about this scene was not just the suggestion that, like, all of this exists within Nico, you kind of have to keep looking. But there's also this, like, and there is darkness in you too, Will. Like, everyone has a bit of both. And you kind of have to address it within yourself too.
I think another way this scene really works for me is how it sets it up too. where she talks about her story, which I think is really interesting because there's been a bit of a reclamation of the Hades and Persephone myth of making it a lot more feminist. And I think, like, in our sort of Hades episode, I was saying, like, it felt like that Persephone was a little bit more of the mythic one, but, like, had moments of, like, this reclamation where you see this other Persephone. And I feel like it was interesting because this Persephone feels a lot more like the reclaimed Persephone version, where she and Hades, like, are genuinely in love and all of this stuff. But I did appreciate the way she sets it up by being like, it's complicated. Don't follow my example.
Yeah, she's like, it's actually really terrible what he did.
Yeah, he did a bad thing to me, actually. And this just happened to work out this way, probably because we're gods. I think that also set up the tone for the conversation in a really interesting way, because it was like, no, you have to, it is, again, sort of doing the thing she's saying, where she's like, no, you have to acknowledge all of this stuff. Mm-hmm. Like, it's messy. So, sorry, this is my other favorite scene in this book. We get brought back to the Gorgira scene where they finally make it to her and the shores of the river Acheron. Mm-hmm. And this image of Gorgira, I love, like, how sad it is. Because I think they've sort of been building her up into this, like, tragic figure. Like, little flashes, though, where you're like, is she rooting for them? Is she not rooting for them? I don't know. It's hard to tell. But she basically talks all about how she was married to Acheron. She's married to this river god, and they're like, well, where is he? The, like, personification of the river. And she's like, well, he got lost within his own, like, spell, essentially, because what the river Acheron does, we learn, is it sort of unmakes people by forcing them to relive all of their pain. And he also, because he took on so much pain from all of these souls, has also, like, fully kind of absorbed within himself, leaving Gorgira all alone. There's something interesting there about, like, misery-loving company and how easy it is to get lost in the negativity. But, like, that inherent tragedy I also love. Like, just this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy of, like, yearning, loneliness, and misery, which, again, it's sort of, like, the thing that's kind of tying everything together structurally. That's what's underscoring all of this, so it works really nicely, I think, thematically with the book. And I think she says a few interesting things during this scene. One of them being that she says nobody tells her story, because no one really reaches her at the edge of the underworld, which is interesting, because I think I've touched on this a little bit, but basically every single mythological reference in this book is somebody that is usually tangentially referenced by being related to or married to somebody else. Like, it'll be like, oh, and Gorgira, wife of Acheron. And that's the only sentence about them in, like, Greek mythology that we have. And that's the same for, like, pretty much all of these characters. Besides, like, Nyx, I think is, like, the one exception. Which I thought was really interesting, this idea of, like, only being a name that's linked to somebody else and something else. And, like, that being your identity, and how no one will tell your story because they don't know it.
What was my first thought? That people can't talk about Will without talking about Nico
that
first.
Is... You stole my analysis, Phoebe. That's what I was gonna say. That was where this was all going. I didn't get to it yet, though.
Sorry.
No, I wasn't gonna bring it up till later. But yeah, that's what I was thinking, because I was like, well, wait a minute, that's an interesting thing to keep bringing up. And then I thought, like, oh, and it's because, like, before this book, this is Will. He is mentioned, like, oh, and then Nico's boyfriend Will. Mm-hmm. But you don't really get his perspective on things. You don't really get anything from him until here. Like, you get a little bit more than these guys do. Like, you know, he's a healer. He's got some scenes with Apollo, you know.
Yeah.
But he's sort of always linked with something else. And that's the thing. Like, most of these mythological figures, they only exist because they're linked with something else. It's, like, finally kind of giving them a chance and a voice to, like, have their story told, to, like, learn more about them and who they are and what they think. Mm-hmm. And I think that was why Gorgira also stood out to me, because she's the only one where she's, like, linked with another figure, but in this story, she is alone.
I like the way that this point is working in conjunction with when she talks about her dress and how it's made of lonely souls, and how at first she was just, like, plucking them from the water to make her dress because she missed her husband, but then the souls started seeking her out because they didn't want to be alone.
Yeah. That's so beautiful. It reminds me of Hades, too, in a way, right? Because it's like, he's the one, like, lamenting his spouse who's away half the year, and he also has like clothing made of these souls. I don't know, it's an interesting like two sides. I really liked her line where she kind of finishes her interaction with Nico and Will by finally getting them to summon the boat, because I guess they give her enough happy memories to actually build something. Like, I'm not sure exactly world building wise how this works. Like, she's weaving things out of what they're giving her, all of their like, and she like pulls it out of them too. She's like pulling their loneliness out of them. She's pulling all these things out of them. And there's like this idea that they have to tell her stories to get the boat with the gun port for some reason.
Just in case.
I was like, why? It's a canoe! But I really liked this quote. It's easy to forget, brackets, love exists, when you collect the souls of the lonely, which is beautiful. And I think it's true. It's like, if you only hear one kind of story and you only talk to if you only deal with one kind of experience, you're gonna forget that others exist. If you're convinced that the only way and the only possible story and the only sort of possible existence is loneliness, you're going to create that for yourself. Okay, so they're sailing the river Acheron into Tartarus.
I wanted to know if you had a reaction, because I had a reaction when Will suddenly was talking about letting Nico kill Octavian.
I don't know. Like, my thought was, like, I wish Will had actually done bad things in the original series, was my reaction. I was like, I would love if he did kill. You know, my reaction was actually, I was like, there's no way Will, because the way it's set up, he's like, I've been in all these battles. I was like, yeah, so he must have killed people. Like, I wish that he'd actually done stuff in the battles, is what I'm saying. It made me wish that he could be like, yeah, I went off and I took a battle shift, because that's what you do as a half-blood.
I personally don't think Will has ever killed anyone. I don't see him taking that kind of role in the battles that he was in. Maybe defending other people. I don't see him ever.
I feel like it ties Will's darkness to Nico in a way I wish it wasn't, is sort of my reaction to it. Like, this, I think this was supposed to be Will's darkness, and it's not. I just want Will to have killed, like, one person, Phoebe.
Why? He just doesn't strike me as that kind of person.
I like this moment because of the fact that it's sort of starting to steer us to reject this idea that Will is on this pedestal of goodness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's interesting, because I want to flag this also, is a moment where it's like, I think either Will or Nico says to the other, the quote is like, and they made them like a promise of hope. And it was like, I love you. And by saying, I love you. So just like flagging this idea that like, I love you is, quote, a promise of hope. Because obviously we've talked a lot about promises in this series. And again, coming back to the whole Orpheus and Eurydice situation, like I'm thinking about love also coming into this in that way too, where it's like, how is love factoring into this underworld story? And I'm flagging it. These thoughts come full circle, I promise.
Yeah, I flagged this promise also because
it
was Nico making the promise, and obviously I need to flag anytime Nico specifically makes any promises.
Nice.
Also, it looks like this on the page, which you wouldn't get.
What? There's a lot more formatting structure stuff I'm just missing.
You really should have been reading the book instead of listening to the audiobook.
Anyway, they land in Tartarus.
We're back in my favorite location. They make like a little lean-to out of the boat where Nico rests and Will leaves him behind to go explore. A very smart thing to do, obviously. I can't remember why he leaves him.
Well, that's sort of a thing. Where Nico's like, why didn't you stay with me? And Will's like, you know? I do enjoy the fact that they're going for like the negative arc kind of happening to Will, which you know?
Mm-hmm.
Because he sort of does the reckless thing where he doesn't really... He, like, has an idea and then just follows it. And ends up getting him into a lot of trouble. And also kind of... He sort of has to also go through his own re-traumatizing moment because with the Stymphalian birds, which are sort of his first... And I guess only real encounter with monsters in the real world. And, like, as soon as he's in Tartarus, he sort of has to relive that.
Yeah, so that's where Will ends up. And at the same sort of moment as he's running into the Stymphalian birds, Nico is, I think, woken up by, his name is Amphithemis, who is looking for the child.
Yeah.
Baby Yoda, of course. Because he's supposed to protect him. He is a satyr. What's a satyr doing down here? You'll find out.
Satyr/centaur.
But Nico starts to think that maybe this guy can help him to find Will, because obviously he woke up and Will wasn't there. He learns over time, talking to this man and following him through Tartarus into who knows where, that the child that he's looking for is Dionysus.
Mm.
There's something I like about just the picture of the gods as babies. Especially Dionysus, who, was once a mortal hero.
Yeah, Dionysus, who also sort of has a duality to him in terms of, like, the cult of Orphism and the not stuff, which we talked about a lot in our sort of Hades episode. But there's also something interesting about, like, grieving the loss of an immortal, losing an immortal, not being able to find, and then, like, thus grieving the loss so much that you become an angry spirit.
This was the coolest twist to me when I read this the first time. And you realized that he was a mania, because, like, when have we really gotten manias in these stories? Not often.
Sort of Hades. Jason encounters one, right?
Rhaena's dad was
and
one.
Rhaena's dad, yeah.
But, like, it's rare enough that it's not on your mind, so there's really no way to see this coming.
Yeah. Like,
you assume he's a real physical guy talking to you. He's maybe a little bit lost in time, but you don't figure that he's a spirit.
Yeah. And again, like, the lost in time thing is really, I think it does a good job of setting up this idea that, like, who knows how long or what's going on with time in Tartarus, and how you can feel like something's just around the corner that's already happened, like, 2,000 years ago. The next big thing that happens is Will manages to get out of Dodge by finding Small Bob. Will ends up tricking the Mania into going after all of the birds and, like, things that Will has accidentally woken up in Tartarus. So, okay, like, on the metaphorical level, right? Will's sort of tramping around, poking at things in Tartarus, and the monsters are all coming out, just to keep an eye on the metaphor. And Nico's mad because he feels like he can save the Mania, basically, and, like, stop it from, continuing to sort of be stuck in its past. And then Nico also gets really mad at Will for abandoning him, which I thought was interesting, because we spent a lot of this book building up Will fearing that he would drag Nico behind and that Nico would leave him behind. Mm-hmm. So it's like it's an interesting kind of reversal of that. Yeah,
this whole moment felt like a reversal of what I expected from them when they were in Tartarus.
Yeah.
I was expecting Nico to sort of forge ahead and scare Will, but as soon as they got there, it was Will forging ahead and scaring Nico.
Yeah.
And I also think this is connected to what I said earlier about Will kind of having that black and white, he is a monster and I'm a demigod and this is how it's supposed to go. Where he drives the Mania away and is like, it was a mania, I thought those were bad and so I got rid of it. What's the problem?
Yeah.
Like, there was no thought in his head of, like, we're going to help this guy.
Yeah.
Because he's bad.
Yeah, and I think this is where we see a bit of the light in Nico, because he's, like, his first instinct is to help him still, even after he's been attacked. Which I think also does speak to, like, there's this greater, I think, undercurrent of a lot of this book, where it's really a lot of Nico's fear of being abandoned. And so I can see him, like, seeing that in the Mania, too, where he doesn't want to leave this thing behind, just, like, doomed to, like, be abandoned, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Like, it makes sense for him to sympathize for a spirit who's just confused at the end of the day.
Yeah. I made my prediction at this point, which was they either take the boat back, which I will admit was my 90% likelihood prediction, but then my other prediction was, or the Mania holds the button.
They help him and he holds the button.
When I was like, that'd be fun, because then we're once again abandoning somebody who needs us in order to get out.
And then they realize that really Percy and Annabeth weren't at fault. Let's not blame them for this.
And then we get, again, another reference to a thing that's like one fucking line in mythology. These things called Eterni.
I loved these guys.
They're linked to Alexander the Great. I will admit, I didn't look super hard, but, like, as far as I can tell, the only information we have on them is they have bones on their head. Alexander the Great fought them, and their names are the Eterni, which do mean Eternals. What was interesting about these guys, though, is, again, we get a reversal where they love dying. They can't wait to die. Which was just such an interesting point of view to have at this point in the story. Like, taking what you said and extrapolating it further, like, we are getting very little of what we're expecting in Tartarus.
Mm-hmm. Because I think it's immediately after this scene that we get, is it Damoson's hut?
Yeah.
And it's completely empty. And you're like...
He died and has a regeneration. He was murdered once again. I felt his death the hardest. That was something that came up when I was re-listening to your sort of thoughts on The Sun and the Star. Because to me, like, I so clearly link Damoson in that hut scene with storytelling. And this, like, gathering around the hearth, around, like, different people to, like, share your life and, like, do it as a community. So I thought it was interesting that he's not there when so much of this book has storytelling in it.
Right, like, if he had been there, I assume their scene would have been...
similar to the Gorgira scene. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the thing, too, because, again, I went back and I re-listened to our House of Hades episode, because I was like, what did I think about this when we first...
That was smart. I don't remember it.
Yeah, because I was like, what did I think about this? It is basically what I just said, but then, like, there's also this added element where both Damoson and Bob really are representative of breaking the cycle in that book.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, sort of the exception that can change things. Damoson as a giant and, like, Bob as a titan. Traditional enemies, like, breaking bread together. And then at the end of the book, the personification of Tartarus, when Annabeth and Percy are leaving, his threat to Bob and Damoson is, if you stay, if you fight me, I will destroy you so much that you will never regenerate. And Annabeth is the one who says no, because she will continue to tell their story and keep them alive and eternal, because they are eternal in that way. Which is also when we get, say hi to the sun and stars for me. Like, it's such a big scene and such a powerful moment, I think, because it's establishing the power of telling a story in a different way to continue with the breaking of the cycle, to, like, keep things alive and to keep things changing. So it's really kind of a gut punch that Damoson doesn't get to come back.
Yeah.
But there's also hope, because if Bob is coming back, then, again, like, whatever Tartarus did to them clearly didn't work. Like, Annabeth has been proven right in this moment. And also, like, really proven right, because, again, if he's coming back as Bob, that would kind of imply that, like, the version of him they're talking about is what's coming back.
Yeah, it's kind of, you'd almost think that we would get to Tartarus and see how maybe that's starting to happen already, like maybe that's happening with Damoson and Bob, but they're still in like a middle ground place, like both of them, you haven't seen them after their journey with Percy and Annabeth, which is almost what you would expect. Like, when I read this book, I was expecting a lot of their interactions with people down here to be in like a post-Percy and Annabeth Tartarus. What does that look like? But instead they weren't running into anything or anyone that they ran into in that book.
I guess sort of makes sense, because really what this book is, it's like, if the labyrinth is grief, this book is PTSD. Tartarus is PTSD. And I'm saying that like I just came up with that, and it wasn't the book that told me that.
It wasn't written in the book.
It is all but explicitly written in the book. Tartarus equals PTSD.
Yeah. If only that were reflected after House of Hades. I don't know.
That's what I was saying, like, discuss? Because I don't think that's what has... But then I'm like, I wonder if that reshapes a lot of my perception of House of Hades, though. Because I'm like, hold on. If House of Hades was Percy and Annabeth working through their PTSD instead of getting it, that might explain why they've never talked about it.
Because they're actually mentally more healthy after going through Tartarus. But, I mean, that connects to... I remember talking about, like, Percy going through his whole, fear of drowning, and then harnessing that in a different way in Tartarus.
One could argue that was them going through their PTSD and coming out with really unhealthy coping mechanisms, actually.
It's a how not to guide, like working through your PTSD.
They came out codependent. They came out You know, this actually does work.
Unable to communicate, codependent.
Percy decided to take his pain and inflict it outwards.
Also tried to punish himself after it by allowing himself to be poisoned, feeling like that was his that was justice.
And then Annabeth, I guess, she forgot it all, so...
Yeah. She totally never thought about Bob ever again, so...
Yeah, that was her journey. You know, I'm not mad at that, though. That's honestly kind of... I'm not mad at that.
I'm not mad at it. It, you know, helps explain some things for me.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. There's a quote from Nico I wrote down that I thought was pretty powerful also. Although right after I have the quote I wrote down, I actually don't know if this is the exact quote.
Okay, I've got my search up.
But they're sort of finally talking about PTSD at this point, and Nico says, "It's hard for me to remember that I used to feel loved," when he's talking about his family. Which, like, I think there's this thing where you come up with these narratives of yourself in your head a lot, where there's often a lot of extremes, I think, where you'll be like, no one ever, like, said this to me. No one ever, you know, treated me well, or all this. There's, like, all these different, like, paths your brain can go down where it starts to see patterns as absolutes instead of as patterns that may or may not have correlation. And it kind of reminded me of the Gorgira line I read earlier, where it's like, if you're only fed this one narrative constantly, if you're only fed this one perspective, if you're only fed this one idea, it can be hard to remember that things exist outside of it. There are things in your life that will not correspond.
Yeah, the quote was, he told Will about his most recent dream, explaining that the memory at the heart of it made him feel loved. I sometimes have to remind myself of that, he said, that people did love me when I was younger.
Wow, I really paraphrased the shit out of that, didn't I?
In his mind, because it's harder for you to remember that when things get dark, right?
There's also an interesting line about how Nico says, like, PTSD can make things feel like they happen to somebody else. So I'm like, oh, interesting, because, like, he's supposed to be... I'm thinking of the Tartarus part where he's supposed to be telling his story, but it's still in third person.
Yeah.
It's like all of these different choices. Like, again, even the third person of this book feels like a choice and, like, making you feel detached from things, uncertain about things, but still constantly, like, reliving them. Anyway, so the sort of bookend Orpheus and Eurydice moment for me was Nico leading Will into the House of Night, like, through this treacherous pathway that only he can see. And Will's, like, right behind him, holding him. Which, again, like, there's some Orpheus and Eurydice myths where they're really far apart, and there's some where she's, like, holding on to him and, like, right behind him. But in this version, he looks back, and it doesn't matter. They still make it in. And we see Bob kind of switching in between his sort of two selves. They fight. There's a big fight. They get Bob out of there. Bob's Bob. There's a wild typo where Nico says, "My mother is Bianca D'Angelo."
I know.
Mother.
Mothers. What was I about to say? Oh, I want to know your thoughts, as someone who presumably knows more about Nyx than I do, on Nyx's depiction in this book versus the way that she was depicted in House of Hades.
I mean, the thing with Nyx is she's not really a character in mythology. She's just sort of like the night. And I think, like, all of her children are sort of these darker sides to things. So I think, like, her being the mother of, like, darkness in a very literal sense is true to her, mythologically speaking. Because, yeah, I don't know, like, night, like, this is something that came up when we were discussing, like, Hesiod in my class. But, like, I think in a world in which none of us have really lived without electric lights, it's hard to remember that for, like, most of human history, nighttime was, like, real scary. Like, if you're just living on your farm in your farmhouse and there's nothing else going on, there's no one else there, and you turn out all your candles, like, that's it. It is dark, starting at, like, whenever sundown is, basically. And who knows what's out there. And so this idea of, like, night being this source of, like, primordial fear and mystery, like, makes a lot of sense, because, like, it really would feel that way. But it's also, like, a primal fear that happens literally every day that you just kind of have to live with. So this idea of, like, Nyx pulling the darkness out of everybody, I do like a lot, and I think that makes sense to me. I don't know about this whole she only wants people to be one thing. Because I think the thing about Night is, like, it's ultimately, it's horror, it's the mystery, it's what is out there. But I don't know what it is, but it instills this deep fear in me.
It could be anything.
Yeah.
It could be so many things.
Yeah. Which is why I think, like, seeing the House of Night, you're like, I don't want to see it, you know? Like, it's the same reaction where I'm like, if you can be one thing, that makes you less scary.
Which seems like kind of the opposite of what she would like.
Yeah. And also this idea, I think for me, like, the way I reconcile is, like, it's not about making people be one thing. It's about making sure people do not leave behind their darkness. And I think a lot of this book is about how you really can't, in the same way that we cannot leave behind Night. You have to kind of make it a part of you and live with it and make that okay. Metaphorically speaking, this scene is great.
Mm-hmm.
I also, it's like, again, I think this story, and I swear you said this. I didn't come up with this. You said it, and I thought to myself, that's smart. I think the way I make how metaphoric this story is work for me is thinking about it like it's the story Nico's telling. Thinking about it like it's supposed to be a story. Because then I'm like, then it makes a lot more sense, and it feels a lot more mythic. If, you know, you're like, please don't pay attention to the logistics. It's a myth. You know? Mm-hmm. Like, yes, of course, our hero is going to literally battle his inner demons. This is what stories are.
And then accept them, of course.
Yes, and adopt them as father. But this idea that this book kind of keeps bringing back, where it's like, you have to embrace these as parts of yourself. Like, these things are not your memories. It is not the past. It is all one person. It is all your identity. I think that's something else that we've talked about a lot, is like memory and identity. And I think this is a nice way of showing all of what we've talked about, where it's like, you are the sum of your memories. Your identity is your memory. I think the thing that I was thinking about a lot that this book left me with is I do like how Bob, he's the one that, like, is like, no, I am capable of change now that I've kind of been broken out of my cycle. And he's, like, going out west, presumably to Mount Orthrus, and presumably to, like, I was getting a, like, continue to break other people out of the cycle vibes. Like, I was sort of, like, I like this idea that change can begin, and it begins with a Titan. And that, like, maybe eventually this will trickle down. Like, it felt like a very interesting way to end, presumably so far, this series and this timeline, because, you know, the next 2 books we have coming out all take place before this. So I did like where we left Bob.
I'm looking for the part where Bob talks about what he's going to do, because I kind of want to read the quote if I can find it. I must head west. It is where I belong. No, that's not quite right. It is where I want to go. Thank you, Will Solace, for helping me obtain my freedom. And then when Chiron asks, where exactly will you go, Bob? He says, I have no idea. The reformed Titan rose and looked to the west, and when he did so, beams of sunlight hit the back of his head. Nico thought they looked like points on a crown. But that is the best possible reality for me. I now have choices when I used to have none. And then he leaves. He just walks off into the forest like people love to do at Camp Half-Blood.
We skipped over the entirety of the dream that Nico has with his family.
We did.
It's a nice bookend, right? Because we sort of started with him seeing Bianca, and now he has another dream of him seeing Bianca. But instead of it turning into horror and the Lotus Hotel and, like, being these sort of recurrences of his past trauma, it's sort of like for real this time, and essentially bending the laws of the universe to get this family reunion to happen. Like, we're rewriting reality a little bit, but in a way that kind of puts a nice cap on all of this stuff. And this whole book that's just one big rewriting of everything, for good or for bad, kind of ending it on the positive.
Yeah, especially looking back on, like, original series Nico and him spending, like, the entirety of Battle of the Labyrinth kind of chasing after Bianca, and then book 5 chasing after his father's approval, and also information about his mom and not getting it. And it's nice to see all of it, like, actually in front of him, when it wasn't something that it seemed like he was ever it was ever possible for him to have.
Yeah, that's true. Like, Bianca, for so much of Nico's arc, is just the one person he's been desperately trying to find again that he can't. Like he finds so much looking for her, and it just never feels like quite enough. So, and I think there's also something there that it's not really explicitly said, but like I feel like there's something there also of him finally getting this moment when he's like being very open about his full self to people, where it's not just like, oh, we love you because you're Nico, but it's like, now that you've gone, not just the gayness stuff, but like everything, now that you've like gone through all of this and shown all of these people all of this stuff of yourself, like now is the time we're coming back. There's no asterisks on that. There's nothing you've held back, you know. It's sort of a full acceptance. My last note is my other mythical parallel that I clocked. I wonder if you clocked this. We end the book with Nico having effectively unleashed all his demons on the world and then holding Hope close. And I was like, hang on a second. And also, Iapetus is the father of Prometheus, Phoebe.
Yep, I see it.
So I was like, wait, it's Pandora. He's Pandora. Yeah. So there's a little bit of Pandora in here. And again, like, the way this parallel is done, I feel like, is much more... It's not a fully realized parallel in the text, but it feels so intentional. And it's a reversal, though, because I think that's the thing. It's like Pandora unleashes all the evils on the world, but slams the jar shut on Hope. When really what's happened is Nico's, quote-unquote, unleashing his evils on the world, but they're not evils anymore because he's been allowed to embrace them, and he's keeping Hope close to himself.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And we start with the jar. Like, we start with him in the jar. I think Pandora and that story does sort of symbolize, I think, the end of the Golden Age. It does symbolize, like, us moving into the age where humans were, like, fully humans. So this idea of, like, a new Pandora bringing a new age through, like, starting, I don't know, there's something there with that. Like, we're kind of opening a new chapter on humanity, like, now that we've kind of released these demons that are not actually demons and confronted them.
I'm imagining, like, the young and very curious Nico in book 3 that we met, opening this jar of horrors upon himself accidentally, and then redefining them over the years. So it works for me.
But, you know what else I wanted to come back to is this idea, that quote I mentioned, where, like, Hope is saying, I love you, essentially. It's, like, equated with hope. And that's, again, where that other mythic parallel, right, the Orpheus and Eurydice that come in, it's, like, loving so much. Like, all of this stuff, I think, converges to me in a pretty way that's sort of ineffable. I can't really fully articulate it, but I feel like they marry each other and complement each other nicely.
Bede?
Probably Gorgira.
The woman?
The boat and her.
Okay.
Her dress, her clothes, I don't know.
Last time I gave this Will's sun orb. Would I continue to give this book that? I was so confident saying that wasn't going to change. I say, no, it's got to stay the orb. I was going to say it's going to be a Care Bear with, like, the light shooting out of its stomach. It's really just, it continues to be symbols of Will.
And his light. It's not the tattoo to prevent demonic possession.
Oh, yes, it's that.
Thank you all for listening to Monster Donut. Next time, the Lightning Thief movie.
Which I've been thinking, should we, like, film our reactions to it? Should we watch it together and film our reaction and post it on Patreon?
I think we should. That should be good. Speaking of our Patreon, if you would like to support us, it would mean a lot. If you do so, you're going to get access to other bonus content from us, such as classics rants of mine that never made the cut, that didn't end up making the cut of our episodes, our predictions episodes, video reactions to things like the movie, as we mentioned, and so on and so forth. Plus early drops of episodes and the most up-to-date information in terms of any interviews we may or may not be doing, etc., etc. If you want to do so, you can go to patreon.com/Monster Donut Podcast. If you would like to reach us, we're eventually going to be doing a gigantic Riordanverse wrap-up, which will not be coming for a while, because we've still got a bit of ground to cover. You can send us any of your thoughts, questions, or reactions to things to our email, which is monsterdungeonpodcast@gmail.com, or you can reach us on social media at PJOpod on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. We also have a YouTube channel if you would rather consume our podcast that way, which also has our video interviews that we've done with the cast.
And that wrap-up, it will essentially be us looking back on everything that has come out of the Camp Half-Blood Chronicles section of the Riordanverse. So those questions can be about literally anything that we've talked about at this point. TV show, books. Draw some lines. Talk about how Battle of the Labyrinth is actually in episode 3 of the TV show, and you can also see hints of it in just the Sea of Monsters movie or something. Say something crazy.
Also, if you are interested in our merch, you can visit our merch shop via our link tree, which is across all of our social media, or go to redbubble.com/monsterdungeon.
Himbo Juice merch is up.
Oh, yeah, Phoebe did make her Himbo Juice t-shirt. It's great. It's really good.
I personally am partial to the mug because it's funny.
Oh, okay, I'm going to order myself a mug. Last but not least,
thank you to our patrons. Latino Kaya, Patty VCK, Bethany from Public Works, Sydney Fox, Joke, Reina Avila Ramirez Ariano, Charlie McNeil, Bronte Lebo, Ethan Not Nakamura, The Damn Meme Page, Kels, Mason Bowman, Casey Cassidy, Fizzy Cat, Natalia Sanchez, Sally Mae, Melissa Rounds, Oat Milk, Alana, Elena, Melanie Valdez, Pamela Ion, The Kid on Her Own, Grace Hunker, Kaylee, Mana Munshin, and Amy Shu. Thank you all so much. Amy joined literally while we were recording.
Oh,
thank you,
thanks,
Amy. We appreciate you all very much. Reaction videos to the movies incoming. Stay tuned. Bye, everybody.
Bye.